And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our YouTube series on the senses, where we are talking with philosophers and people from all kinds of other disciplines about the five senses. I'm Ellie Anderson, one of your co hosts of Overthink podcast. And this YouTube series is linked to our podcast series on the senses, which you can find on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. Hopefully, you are listening already, but if not, go ahead and check us out. And this is a unique interview for our YouTube channel because it is also the one that we are putting on the podcast feed as part of David's and my episode on smell. So check out that episode on smell. David and I on the podcast introduce this interview with about 15 to 20 minutes of other content on the philosophy of smell. And that said, we are so delighted to introduce our guest today. David, over to you.
Thanks, Ellie. Yes, we are super excited about our conversation today with Ben Young, who is an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, my alma mater. So there is a connection here between Ben and I. And there he teaches in the Department of Philosophy and in the Institute for Neuroscience. His work often crosses over the line between philosophy and science. And he is the author of several articles about olfaction, which is the subject for today's interview. And his most recent projects include the co edited textbook with Carolyn Dicey Jennings, Mind, Cognition, and Neuroscience, as well as a forthcoming co edited collection with Andreas Keller entitled Theoretical Perspectives on Smell. So, when it comes to the sense of olfaction, he is the person that you want to go to. And currently, he's finishing a book that is tentatively titled Stinking Philosophy. So hopefully we will talk about the use of that title, Stinking Philosophy. Is it that philosophy stinks, or is it that we want to stink up philosophy? So we'll get to some of these questions. And Ben, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. And I wanted to just tell you that I really loved the tagline for your podcast.
Oh,
That because it turns out I usually joke that I have the greatest conceivable philosophical method, and I call it lounge chair philosophy. And it's every summer where I take my books to the pool or to the beach and just kind of like sit there on my lounge chair reading and pontificating or thinking. So thank you so much for having me.
yeah.
It's really a pleasure. So we're about to just jump right into it because I suspect there's going to be a lot of questions that we have for you about your understanding of perception and cognition in relation to smell. And so one of the places where it makes sense to begin is with what in your work you call the olfactory object. So you make the argument in one of your articles, which is entitled "Smelling Matter," that most of us have this folk understanding of what it is that we're smelling when we are smelling. We think we know what is happening, but in reality, we are typically mistaken about the object of our olfactory perception. And so I want you to talk to us a little bit about that folk understanding that we have, how it leads us astray in thinking about olfaction, and how you understand the nature of the olfactory object. And then how this is a very complicated question, as you can already see, and then how all of this fits into the history of the philosophy of smell. So, what kind of intervention are you making?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I certainly did say that there's this folk conception and it gets most everything wrong. Um, and I think that was like a nice foil for the paper. I don't know if I still would stand by that. So I don't know if we actually have a uniform folk conception of what smells might be, right? And far be it from a philosopher who spends all their time like reading and writing for almost like 15 years now about smell to tell everyone else what they think, right? But that's what
we
philosophers
do.
like to
We
do,
tend to
right?
do that all the time with that lounge chair
It
philosophy you're
keeps our
mentioning.
job. That's how we keep our positions in academia.
So so I don't think there's gonna be one uniform. I think there might actually be a lot of different folk conceptions that are probably mediated by language and culture and the use of smell on a daily basis. Um,
Mm,
that being said, I'm pretty sure that our everyday conception of smells are heavily mediated by our being visually dominant, and that we use language and vision to think about and theorize and navigate our environments all the time. And in that sense, when we start talking about what objects are in reality, right, both as the things that exist and the things that we kind of play around with and use, then visions turns out to be the default. And on the default account of what we think objects are on an everyday basis, they're kinds of things that you would pick up and manipulate. The way that at least vision scientists usually refer to these things is they're punctate entities. They're things that have
Mm,
boundaries and edges, right? They're the things that you can manipulate to some extent. And in that sense, if you were thinking about everyday objects, you probably have a cell phone, right, within arm's reach, right? You are probably sitting at a certain distance from the screen, and so when we start thinking about objects in a visual sense and we talk about these, we're usually talking about them as things that exist in reality with clear boundaries and they have some sort of spatial connection to us relative to our bodies, right? Either how we manipulate them or how we're located relative to them. I think that whole picture goes out the window when you start thinking about smells. Smells aren't the same kinds of things. You don't really manipulate smells. You don't pick them up and move them around, right?
mm,
And at the same time, it turns out to be you can have an experience of smell of things at a great distance. Right. So one of my favorite examples about how smells will change at great distances is coming from Reno to the North California coast. You start off in an arid desert, and it has its own shrubbery, right? And it has a certain smell to it. And then you get up into the Sierras, and then you have the pine smell of the Sierras, and eventually you
mm.
hit right the Central Plain, right? And you get that smell of all the agriculture, right? Usually fertilizer to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Or slugs, depending upon the time of year. And then
Mm,
eventually you hit like the North Cal coast, right? You get the smell of a different pine smell and the eucalyptus and the briny ocean. Um, Now, in that sense, there's going to be a point towards the end where you can smell the bay, right? Or you can smell the Pacific Ocean, right? Well before you can see it. And
mm,
that's not like the usual visual objects. So we can smell things at great distances from us and report that we're smelling them. At the same time, smells are weird because we can walk in them, right? I mean, most visual objects you can't inhabit. So I like to talk about these
Mhm.
in terms of you're kind of in this odorous plume, but it's a sea of smells. So you're constantly surrounded by smells, and there's these different air currents, right? And somehow we are in them. But that's hard to think about from like a visual standpoint, right? Because there's not many objects that you would say you can visually inhabit. So in that sense, smells don't behave in the same way that we would expect from visual objects. So when we start talking about the object of smell, what we're trying to figure out is there are these things that we recognize on an everyday basis as smells. And they can be vast distances from us. They can also be diffused. We can inhabit them. But a lot of the time, we don't attend to smells. So all of a sudden, we just have this experience that there's some sort of smell, like right here at the tip of the nose or inside the nostrils, as some philosophers like to say. And then we're like astounded that it's there. Right? Um, so the difficulty we run into when we start even thinking about smells is that the background assumptions that we have to talk about smells don't look like the ones that we would have from vision. And where I think
mm,
the folk conception, at least in English, goes wrong is we say we smell the object, we smell the orange. So you say, "Oh, I've got an orange smell." And then you think what you're actually smelling is that orange over there on the table, right? Or the ocean as you're sitting on the beach. So in those instances, the wonder is going to be what exactly is the smell? Because there's certainly a sense in which the orange isn't lodged in your nose, right? And there's
mhm.
a certain sense in which, even though you're taking in the smell of the ocean or the plumes from the ocean, right, it's not directly that thing out there. So we usually refer to the objects in terms of the source. But I think the source gets things wrong, and we'll circle back to this. So let's get back to the olfactory object. What do I mean by object of smell? And I think the question actually in the end has sub questions to it. So we say, like, what are smells? We say, well, they're things that we smell, they're objects in reality. And there's two ways to unpack this. One way is to say that there's an object in the environment. I call this the distal question, right? What is the distal stimulus? What is the thing out there that we are
Mm,
smelling? Is it the source? Is it the plume? Is it something else, maybe entirely? And then there's another question, which is what is our experience of smells? Often philosophers like to call this the intentional object, right? What's the thing that we're representing in our mind as being smells? How do we experience as a smell? And I think there's even a sub question here, which I tease out in the smelling matter question, which is what makes a smell the way it does, right? As I like to say it,
Hmm.
right? Why does a smell that way? And I call this the olfactory quality, right? What gives it that qualitative character that oranges smell different than lemons, or that pines in the Sierra smell different than the Monterey pines that you might have along the North California coast? So I think there's three different questions that are all housed within the olfactory object question. And I think we have to be really careful to keep those separate, right? So what's the distal object? What do we experience as smells? How do we talk about these things and categorize them and think about them? And then what accounts for the quality of a smell? Why does that smell in a particular way? And so when you start thinking about it in those three sets of questions, then you can begin to trace the history of smells. And there's not much within philosophy. So most of us who work in this area, and it's growing steadily. So I think there's about 20 philosophers who work on smell full time or as a specialization now. It used to be like
Hmm.
3 to 5, so a handful at most when I started out.
Wow.
Um, and and I think there's just this neglect of smell. I don't know if it's a conscious neglect or whether or not it's just there's so many other interesting things to do, and vision as it is so complex, and language is kind of awesome too, that why worry about smells? But there was a great time where smells were talked about. So, of course, Plato and Aristotle are going to factor in any historical account, right? Where we have to go back to as people would say, right, the originals, because we're footnoting them or something. And I think by default, most contemporary people are more like Plato than Aristotle. So, Plato has this claim that really the olfactory qualities of smell don't really have qualities. The only basic categories of smell are just whether or not they're pleasant or unpleasant, or whether or not they have a good valence or bad valence. But what he does say regarding the odor object itself is that the odor object is a matter of the original source object diffusing and giving off parts. Uh, This seems to be the folk conception to some extent, right? And Plato probably nails that as the original folk philosopher, right? Where he goes, hey, it's not that you're smelling the actual orange, right, or the ocean. You're smelling parts of that has detached into a vaporous cloud. And then the vaporous cloud gets stuck in your nose. And that's what you smell. And there's, I think, an open question there, which no one's really answered for Plato or in any of the debates, is whether or not it has to be all the parts of the object that's diffused. So, are you smelling every aspect of the orange, or just some subparts of the orange that have smells? Um,
Hmm.
and it's unclear whether he held one of those two views. I think the default is usually to just assume it's everything about the orange that you're smelling. So, all the properties of the orange. Aristotle, on the other hand, wasn't exactly sure how to characterize the qualitative character question. But given his general claim that what you're smelling is going to be some sort of media, or what you're seeing is the form of matter as it transmits through something, he claims that what we have is these things called flavorful entities. And flavorful entities then go through this medium of air or water, because he wants to account for aquatic species being able to smell as well. And so it's going to be the
Ah.
same kind of flavorful entity that's going to either go through the medium of air or water for us to be able to, in the end, smell it. But what is really fascinating about Aristotle is he's not clear on whether or not smell should be considered to be a distal sense or a proximal sense, whether or not we are, in the end, sensing something at a distance or sensing something close by. And he says, well, smell's kind of a hybrid. It's a little bit of both, because you can smell things at a vast distance, but at the same time, you are literally touching the thing because it's getting lodged inside your nose. So
Mhm.
he considers it somewhere between flavor or taste and touch. And I think that gets the dialectic kind of right for the olfactory object, right? On the one hand, smells seem to get stuck, they literally hit you in the nose, right? And at the same time, you smell things at a vast distance. Now, there's then, I think, 100, maybe 200 years worth of debates by the commentators on Plato and Aristotle about the nature of distal smells and which account captures the distal ability of smell or the olfactory quality better. I'm no expert on this area, but I think there's a philosopher, Johnston, who has written numerous articles. Richard Sorabji has some great collections
Mm.
of commentators where you can find these debates. And one of my favorite debates is they actually bring in avian olfaction to try to settle the debate. So the question that they ask is, how is it possible that a vulture or a raptor can smell a dead animal from miles away? And so then they're trying to figure out, well, it can't be that it's a vapor, because how could a vapor get 100 miles into the air? It must be something about how we have dissociations of flavorful things in mediums. And you can see them going back and forth trying to kind of hash out how different animals can smell. But the really cool thing that I want to highlight then is that according to everyone in the debate, the thought is supposed to be that whatever it is that humans are doing in terms of their smell, animals are also doing. So if fish turn out to have this flavorful medium for aerosol that goes through water, then it turns out that we can smell the same things as fish or lobster or crabs. And so the thought is supposed to be that since smell is this ancient sense, at least this is my interpretation here, that we're going to have more or less the same olfactory objects across species, which is actually borne out by the way the scientists do research in olfaction, where the assumption is going to be that animal models from insects to aquatic species, to avian species, all the way through, of course, rodents and mammals to humans, is going to be mostly conserving and preserving the same kinds of things that we smell. So jumping ahead horribly historically, there's not much of a debate from like Plato and Aristotle to the commentators to the moderns. And of course, within
Mm.
the moderns, you're going to have Locke having his distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And he's going to say, well, obviously, smells can't be things in reality that are mind independent. They must be something about how the mind generates a smell. And so, in that sense, a smell is supposed to be something that's mind dependent and generated by the mind. Reed differs with Locke to some extent, and there's some debate now in the literature that's slowly coming out about how to interpret Reed's idea. But he's having a similar idea that turns out to be that the olfactory quality, or what we consider to be the thing smell, is something about how the mind imposes a smell upon the objects in reality, the distal entities. Okay, and now I'm going to jump again horribly to Perkins. So there's this great philosopher, Moreland Perkins, who writes a book in 1983 that is a wonderful book on the senses. It has like 3 chapters on smell, the most robust account of smell from Aristotle.
Mm.
Um, right, so there's this almost 2,000 years, right, of empty literature on smell within philosophy. And of course, we're just covering Western philosophy. I mean, there must be philosophy that's latent within at least Indian traditions and Chinese and Japanese traditions and world traditions, right? Which I don't have a background in or know anything about, which would also say something more about the nature of smell. So McHugh has a book about Indian literature that actually documents some of the theories of smell they have within Japanese culture. They have different ceremonies and games that they play with smell. So there are other rich traditions about
Cool.
smell that might not have this 2,000-year gap for the most part. But jumping to the modern traditions all agree to some extent that what we're smelling is something like a gaseous cloud. The question is going to be, for the most part, whether or not the mind imposes the quality on the cloud, or whether or not it's something about the cloud that then gets lodged into our nostrils and gives us a perception of the things out there. Um, and so, one way of highlighting this is that Bill Lycan writes this wonderful paper called The Sliding of Smell that says basically philosophers need to pay more attention to smell. There's all these cool things that happen in smell that will question our pre theoretic ideas and that will bring to bear different ways of thinking about objects and perception. And his claim that he highlights is that the object that we smell, the intentional object that we smell, is we smell gaseous clouds, odors. Um, and since we smell these gaseous clouds, we don't have to worry that obviously we're smelling the odor source, the orange. We're smelling the cloud given off by the orange. This is the vapor view for the most part, though it's not noted as such. Now, Claire Batty then picks up on this idea a little bit further and says, well, here's the other weird thing about this. If it turns out to be that we're smelling turns out to be these gaseous clouds, odors, then they have weird persistence conditions. They exist in different ways than normal objects. I mean, you ever have that moment you come home and you have family or a roommate or someone there who happens to bake cookies, and you walk in and you smell cookies, and you're like, "Oh,"
Lucky.
right? You made
Best case
cookies, and
scenario for sure.
right? I mean, it's like that's a good day, right? You come in, there's the smell of fresh warm cookies, and you're all excited, and then you're like, "Oh, you made cookies." They're like, "Yeah, we ate them." Right? So when that happens, right, aside from your expectations automatically going, "Oh," right, like, "Well, why?" Right? Why
Mm.
mess with me that way? But there's a real sense in which the smell is there, but the cookies aren't. Right? So
Mm.
we have this
Worst
weird
case
bit, right?
scenario.
Right?
Mhm.
So now you're sitting there and you're frustrated and you're going, "But I can smell cookies," right? And there's a clear sense in which you are accurately having an experience of a smell. There's nothing illusory or a hallucination going on, right? You're not hallucinating or having some sort of weird, non-normal experience. There's really the thing there. There's just no object anymore, right? So there's no visual object. And what she wanted to point out was the persistence conditions of smells seems to be very different than the persistence conditions of other kinds of objects. You can smell them even though they've been consumed, right? And so, in that sense, the object of olfaction, in that sense, has different existence conditions than the visual objects we might have.
Mm.
Um, Now, she thinks that our experiences of smell at an instant don't present us with smells as inhabiting an exact coordinate in space. We experience the smells as being in an environment, but they don't have the same kind of spatial temporal locations, right? The place in some sort of coordinate space as being reachable to us or from a distance from us in the same way that visual objects do. Um, and so I think that's really interesting claim to have, right? So we have a distal experience of a smell. We can inhabit the smell. It exists at a different rate than a visual object, right? But at the same time, it turns out to be that it doesn't present itself as being out of place. Now, I disagree with her. We'll circle back to this, but I think the more interesting disagreement that all of us have here, because I happen to be an odorant theorist too, is what is it about the cloud that gives it the smell that it does? So if you think about your environment as being a gaseous sea of invisible clouds, then why is it that you smell one set of clouds over another? Right? So you walk in the house, right? You smell the house, the environment, right? But you also smell the cookies against the environment, right? So what is it about the plume itself or the odorous cloud that gives you this cookie smell? And so what I argue is this is where matter comes in. It's something about matter that smells. So it's not something that our mind imposes upon matter, but matter itself
Mhm.
generates smells, which we then transduce. And I'll just be unclear here because I don't know whether or not it's the mind making the smell or the environment making you smell something in some way.
Yeah.
It's probably some give and take, and I have no idea how to work that question out. And I have a paper noting this that I say I don't know how to solve this problem actually. But it's quite clear that there's something about the molecules themselves that generates our experience of smell. And so, if we begin to look at monomolecular chemicals, right, so chemicals that are of a single variety, it turns out to be that we can manipulate these in certain ways that has predictable different smells. So, if you think about what a limonol smell would smell like, limonol is the fancy word for something that smells like lime. But if you were to imagine a lime smell, and then I say, hey, what would that smell like if we added a chloral group? So chlorine smell. Can you now imagine chlorine and lime together? Well, yeah. So we can add these functional groups, as they're called, and then predictably change the smell of this single chemical structure. It turns out to be that there's also chemical structures that are exactly the same, but they differ in terms of their handedness, such that you have the same thing, but you can't superimpose them upon each other. Chiral properties is what it might be called. And so
Mm.
those have different smells. Now, when I say those have different smells, most of the time we can only smell one out of the two. So most of us turn out to be usually be anosmic to one of the chirals as opposed to the other. So in the industry, when they generate an artificial smell, they add in a lot of both the left and right-handed ones when it comes to making sure that the entire population smell things. But those differ in smell. And if those differ in smell, then it turns out to be that it must be something about the structure, that they have a left-right group to them. So the claim that I run with is that the structure of matter smells. Now, what exactly is the structure? I don't know. That's something for the neuroscientist and the psychologist to figure out as time goes on. Maybe it's something about how the structure in the end fits into the receptor. Maybe it turns out to be that it's something about how the structures bind together. Maybe it's something about how all the different kinds of structures that you have as they get into your nose do something in terms of complex patterns of activation. Who knows? It's an open question. So I like to leave it there, right? I mean, so one of the nice things about being a philosopher is knowing your limits and going like, here's my theory.
Yeah.
I don't
Oh,
know whether or not it's going
absolutely.
to be true or not.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
hope. Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Is one of the hopeful benefits of being a philosopher is knowing what you don't know, right, and knowing the limits of what you do know. So this is all super fascinating. This account that you've given for us, in particular, I picked up on something earlier that you said about how we inhabit smells because I think that helped me put into place a distinction between taste and smell because so many people talk about how taste and smell are really not that distinct. But I think what you said, the fact that we inhabit smells, but I think we could say we don't inhabit taste is quite interesting. But I want to think about how the kind of underprivileging of smell has I don't know, sort of proven inadequate in the history of philosophy. You've pointed out a number of views in the history of philosophy about smell and also the fact that we tend to undervalue it, right? And in your dissertation, you argued that most theories of consciousness and cognition, in particular, privilege senses other than smell. But if we start from smell, then these theories prove inadequate. So, can you tell us a little bit about how, following the historical underprivileging of smell, we get to an impoverished view of what human cognitive processes look like? How would we think about thinking if we started from smell instead of, say, vision?
Okay. Yeah. So sure. Do you mind if I start with perception, get to cognition, and then move on to like how we're conscious of smell?
Sounds
Um,
good. Yeah.
s-
And I think given the richness of the answers that you're giving us, we might even close with this because we have so much there's so much already. So maybe we'll ask you in another time about how COVID relates here because I'm curious about this kind of like loss of smell. But yes, that sounds great, Ben. Go for it.
okay. Sure. So one thing you might just want to think about, right? If the objects are a little bit different, that means that they're going to have different spatial coordinates, right? But that's also going to mean that you might have to think about the time scale, right?
Mhm.
So one thing about not thinking about other senses than just vision or using language to theorize is that you assume that the time scale of your experiences is going to be the ones that you get in vision. And the moment you open your eyes, right, you're automatically presented with objects that have spatiality to them, that have a distance to you. But when you think about smells, they're really slow. So I have usually have a presentation every now and then when I present the difference between how quickly you can see something versus smelling something. But you can see a gorilla flashed on a screen, right? The classic change blindness
Yep.
experiment,
Psych 101.
right? Within 15 milliseconds, right? Extremely fast. It takes 150 milliseconds for you just to detect and discriminate a smell. And then it turns out to be that you become conscious of that smell like 300 milliseconds. At half a second, you begin to have an experience of whether or not it's a good or bad smell. And only at like a second can you say, like, I know what I'm smelling. So it's an order of a magnitude slower. So, one thing you might think about is how our temporal experience of reality is shifted by thinking about vision versus audition, right? Which might be a little bit slower than vision, or something like smell, which is going to be slower than both of them. And so, what
Mm.
I'd like to argue quite often is smelling takes time. So if you want to have your experience of the ocean and the sagebrush, right, and the trees along the way, and whatever else it might be, the taco stand, hopefully down the beach, right? So when you have all this together, it takes a lot of time to begin to realize that you have this, what I call a smellscape. with complex smells against a background of other smells. And most of the time, since we don't only use smell and we smell something and then we glance around, we get these multimodal cues that kind of fill in the smellscape for us. So one thing that might be different is just trying to figure out what would our picture of reality be like if we had to rely upon a different sensory modality that was slower than vision. Um, Maybe it might even boil down to like our patience with actually in the end in looking at scenes and thinking about how to use scenes. So that would be one thing that I've stressed in some more recent writings, that what we consider to be objects might be relative to a sensory modality and the temporal dimension of that. um, in the same way that you can say that you can see mountain ranges, right, but it takes time to see a mountain range, right? It's not something
Mhm.
that you can usually just open your eyes and see all of a sudden. So that would be one way that things would shift if we started focusing on the perceptual and temporal dimensions. But let's talk about cognition then, right? So when we start thinking about how we think about things, it's very clear that this is mediated by vision and language. And the nice thing about vision is that it usually presents us with a complex object with all of its parts all at once. Right? So if we imagine a very simple object, right, just like a Necker cube, right? Even when you just have some visual imagery of a Necker cube, you can see the edges, right? You can see the lines, right? Maybe if you're gifted at visual imagery, you can manipulate whether it's going in or out from you. But all those parts of it are all there, right? But when you think about smells, most smells are not these monomolecular ones that I talked about before. They're mixtures, right? So if you think about smelling the taco stand down the beach, right, you're not smelling one thing, you're smelling tacos, but tacos are going to be something about the corn tortilla, right? They're going to be whatever kind of protein you're putting inside. There's going to be the sauces as well, right? And so as someone's in the end grilling the food, right, and you're getting this waft of a plume, you're getting a complex mixture of different molecules altogether. But yet you recognize it, right, as
Mhm.
that thing. So the wonder is then going to be, can you detract the parts of the thing within the smell from the complex smell itself? And here's what I've been arguing for a while now. We smell these objects, these odor plumes, as uniform yet complex entities, but we don't have access to the parts. So an example that I like to often use in talks is if you think about pasta sauce, right? Like most pasta sauces that have a tomato base are not going to differ in too many ingredients, right? So your average tomato basil sauce, right? It's going to have tomatoes and basil in the name, right?
Mhm.
Some garlic, some onions, right? Right. So kind of simple, right? You think about shifting that to puttanesca sauce, right? Where you're having some sort of anchovies and some black olives in it, right? Now you can clearly taste the difference between the two sauces. But if I was to ask you and you didn't make the sauce, so you don't know what went into it, what's in it, right? So you're sniffing it, you're going, oh, I can tell like A is different than B, right? They clearly smell different to me. They're both pasta sauces, so same category. And you go, okay, so what's the difference? What are the components of that? Now, notice if I showed you a square and a triangle, you'd have no problem saying these components are different because of lines and edges and angles and so on and so forth. When it comes time to smell, we get these holistic experiences of a complex entity that don't give us the parts. So, the fancy way of putting this is that you have a compositional entity, you have a complex representation that is composed from parts, but it's
Yeah.
not decomposable. You can't, in the end, pull out the parts. Now, here's my favorite experiment to prove this. So, Lang and Livermore did these experiments where they had 5 to 8 component smells. You would sniff each of them in order. Then they would put them together into a mixture. You'd be given the mixture, you would sniff it, and you'd be asked what's in the mixture. Most subjects can get 3 to 4 components. 3 is the average, right? So you smell it and you go, oh, it's these 3 out of those 5 or 8. Now, it turns out to be that even if you have access to all of them, so you can smell the complex and go back to the individuals, you can still only identify 3 at a time. Now, professional chefs, when they want to decompose a recipe, the trick is to sample it over time. So each time you get a few more of the notes or the component parts. So if we start thinking about smells cognitively as these complex entities that don't have component parts, or at least you don't have access to the component parts, notice that that's a very different category of thing than your visual objects. Now, one way this might play out is if it turns out to be that how we, in the end, sense smells and think about smells turns out to be in a different kind of format, that it has a different structural representation than vision, then that would explain why we're really bad at naming smells. And we're horribly bad about this.
Yeah.
Right. So here's one of my favorite examples. Right. You blindfold someone. I'm borrowing this from Noam Sobel. He says, take it out of the refrigerator. Don't take it out of like a room temperature cupboard. So take out any random condiment that you have and blindfold the individual and go, hey, what's this? Right. Have them sniff it. And it could be something that they have in their sandwich every day, like peanut butter. Right. And they sniff it and they go, I don't know. Right. And like, well, is it sweet or savory? And they'll go like a little bit of both. Right. And then you get tuna fish, right? Open the can, you stick it under their nose. What's that? And they're like, I'm not sure, right? Smells a little fishy, right?
Hmm.
They won't necessarily be able to name it. Now, the really cool thing about this is if you ask people, can you use them together, right? Peanut butter and tuna fish sandwich, right? People will be like, oh, I'm not so sure, right? But if you get them jelly after the peanut butter and go, hey, can you put those together? They're like, oh, yeah, those go together.
Hmm.
Peanut butter and tuna, not so sure. So we have access to something about the categories and what they can be used for. We might be bad at naming them, but it turns out we could probably say what's edible or not. So if you, after the peanut butter, you get out some dishwasher liquid and you stick it under their nose, you go, hey, are these the same? No. Would you put them together in a sandwich? Absolutely not. Right? Would you eat this? Well, the peanut butter, yes. The dishwasher, no. So we do have access to information about them. We just don't have access to perhaps the component parts or the ability to name them. That might be either something about how the brain is wired up, which is one theory out there, or it might be something about the format, that vision and our normal conceptual repertoire of semantics turns out to be independent of the language system in olfaction. And it might just be because the structure of cognition between the two or the representational format is different. Moving on to consciousness, since I want to try to get through as to acknowledge if we can.
Mhm.
So consciousness is another big one. When I first started out, my first paper was called Stinking Consciousness. Um, and it was kind of like exactly that. It was like a punch in the
Stinking oh,
nose.
I heard thinking consciousness,
Oh,
stinking consciousness, a lot
no,
juicier.
No,
Okay.
yes.
it was the
A lot
build up to that
smellier.
book
Yeah.
that's coming up,
Yeah.
Stinking Philosophy.
So, and it was meant in a very aggressive fashion. It was kind of like, you guys who are doing consciousness, right? You stink. And it was a very
Yeah. Oh, we
simple
know.
premise.
We're phenomenologists. We think most people who work on consciousness stink too.
Well, so there's this really cool thing about the olfactory system. Neurologically, it just doesn't go via the thalamus. So within one kind of length of a neuron, you get from the olfactory bulb here in your nose, right, or right above the nose because it's kind of in your cranial cavity, to the cortex. It doesn't go via the thalamus, which is like a way station in some senses for neuroscience. And so there are all these theories of consciousness that said the thalamus is necessary for consciousness. And I went, that can't be right because I'm conscious of smells all the time, but it doesn't have to go
Mm.
by the
Mhm.
thalamus. So it seems like a kind of like a low hanging fruit of a paper to write, right? Which is the perfect one that you need at graduate school level, right? You just get that
Totally.
paper out and you're like, you're all wrong, right? So, so it turns out to be that some people actually just went all in and would go like, oh, so since smell doesn't go by the thalamus, it must mean we're not conscious of smells. I went, no, that can't be right because I have phenomenology of smell all the time. Um, so one thing that you might point out is just if the system works differently and the anatomy is different, then our theory is going to have to be different. And there's now a new debate going out whether or not consciousness is in the front of the cortex or in the back of the cortex. But that
Mm.
whole framework only makes sense if you're a vision scientist, because vision's at the back in the occipital cortex, and you have the frontal cortex, which does things like cognition and I will say consciousness,
Oh
because smells in
god.
the front. But that doesn't make sense from smell, right? Because smell would never happen in the back of your brain unless something really wrong happened in terms of neural atypical structures.
Yeah,
So
I
a
mean, I
lot
also
of
think
these,
people who wanna locate consciousness in anywhere in the brain should probably reread Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia's, letters to Descartes, but in any case, back to what you were saying.
but in any case, we're not going to put it in the pineal gland at least.
Yeah.
And I mean, some people have put the consciousness of smell actually in the olfactory bulb based upon some theories of physics, wherever it might occur, right, it's going to be clear that, at least to me, that vision's going to work one way, smell's going to work another way. And if we want like a uniform account of the manifold of experience, right, of our everyday occurrences of phenomenology and qualitative character, then we're going to have to take in these weirdnesses about smell as well. Um, so one last thing, it turns out not just the neuroscience frameworks, but even the philosophical frameworks about thinking about how there might be different kinds of consciousness might work differently when it comes to smell. So you might not think that consciousness is one uniform phenomena. It might be that in the same way that there's different kinds of memories, right? Episodic memories about places, autobiographic memories that have you and somehow warm childhood memories to them, semantic memories that come in linguistic formats, or facted memories that seem like language and logic, that consciousness is probably something slightly different too. And so you might think that there's high levels of consciousness. We'll call them maybe awareness, right? When you say you're aware of something, it's very clear that what you mean is that you're aware that you're having a conscious experience and what the experience is about. There might be other experiences that you have that you don't have the awareness, but there's something going on. So example that some people like to use is like long distance driving. You get to the Central Plains and you realize that you have this 2-hour drive to get from one side to the next, and it's a straight highway for the most part. And at some stage, you zone out, right? And you kind of go, hey, did we get to Sacramento yet? Right. And it turns out to be that you could probably, as long as you're on the straight road, not be aware of exactly what's going around you, but still be able to drive the car with full faculties without getting in accidents. So there might be a sense in which you have access to information, but you're not aware that you're using the information. Right? Or if someone in the end throws a ball at you, you might be able to grab it as it's coming at you, right? But you're not aware that you did this complex motoric movement to get there. But then there might be another kind of consciousness, just the qualitative character of experience. Bad way of putting this is the fuzziness, right? Or as I like to put it, right, the olfactory qualities, that there are this experience of smells. And the really cool thing about smell is that anytime you're aware of a smell, it has an olfactory quality. At least I've argued this in a paper called Smelling Phenomenal.
Mm.
But it turns out to be that we have lots of instances where we have a phenomenal or a qualitative experience, but we're completely unaware that it's happening. So I can even list off some examples. So you choose sexual mates based upon smell. And there was the extent that people used to have dirty T-shirt speed dating. So they would have men wear a T-shirt for a few days and get it all stinky,
I think
and
I
then they
heard about this.
right,
Yeah.
and then they would send it around um, to the other cohort, and they would sniff it, and without seeing, they would select which number smelled best to them. Um, and it turns out to be there's something to this, that it turns out to be that your body gives off certain compounds which are part of the immune system, and that complementary immune systems smell better to you than the same immune system. It's unclear why this is the case, right? Some people theorize it's so that you don't have inbreeding, because if someone has the same immune
Hmm.
system, they're probably a relative. Other people think
Ah,
it's
interesting.
right, which would be very helpful, right? If you could smell that someone was your sister or cousin or something, because at least for genetics, that would be a really bad idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, right. So there's that. There's social acquaintance selection. So you select people that smell more like you. Um, and it might be because of the environmental context or the things that you cook or the detergents you use. There's also, it turns out to be a valence to it. So there's some interesting research being done about in-group or out-group selection, whether or not someone is included within the group or whether or not someone feels like an outcast of the group. And it turns out to be that if someone doesn't smell like the group to some extent and they come up with a really bad excuse for why they need to leave, everyone's kind of like, okay, that's okay. And they don't like call you on it. Like you go, oh, I think I might have left my oven on. But you're like, okay, that's fine, right? Even though most of us as competent adults should know that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
here's the weird thing though. When was the last time you sniffed someone? I mean, I tell my students I smell them, right? And they find that to be like really aggressive. They're like, what do you mean you smell me? Like, how did you invade my personal space? I'm like, no,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. My
I don't
students
mean
get
like, I'm
creeped
like,
out for
here,
sure.
come in,
I
I'm a hug.
inhabit your smell,
Right?
which sounds maybe even worse.
It's right, like if you tell your students you see them, right, that's a compliment. Like I saw you, right? But you tell
Yeah.
your student, I smell you, right? And it turns out to be right.
Yeah, other
Um,
senses could be worse.
Right, so we certainly don't consciously do that, right? And we might say, like, we love someone's smell, right? But it's not like as part of the dating ritual, right? You have to sniff someone, and if you did, that would be really awkward, right?
Yeah.
But it's very clear that we're tracking this information unconsciously. Now, here's where this gets really weird. So anosmia, right? So you might go like, how could you even prove this, right? Because
And
it's not like
anosmia is absence of smell, right?
absence of smell, right? So there are an unfortunate group of individuals. It's up to 12% of the US population as of 2020 that develop
Wow.
either smell loss or partial smell loss. I don't know the numbers when it comes to congenital anosmia, so people born without a sense of smell. But Maria Talafia has this great paper. She's a congenital anosmic, trying to explain what it's like growing up without a sense of smell, and people around you are talking about this invisible thing, right? That you can't see and you can't touch, but is there. And so with anosmics, people that are not congenital anosmic, when they develop a sense of smell loss, this is tied to anhedonia, a general feeling that things are worse off. So not depression,
Whoa.
but just that your quality of life is not as enjoyable anymore. Now, in addition to that, there is an increase in depressive rates amongst people who lose their sense of smell. This is then directly tied to increases in rates in suicide attempts.
Oh my
Um,
god.
and it turns out to be that your general quality of life score goes drastically down when you lose your sense of smell. So here's my pontification on this, and I call it the argument from absence. Smell provides this background phenomenology, this qualitative character to our daily lives that we don't attend to, that's just there. And then when we lose it, it's like there's a note from the quality of our life that's gone missing. Something has dropped down. Now, a friend of mine who in the end got anosmia from COVID about a year ago described it as feeling like he was a robot in his body, that he would go into the shower
Mm.
and he would have, the usual like soap up your hair experience. And you get the tactile experience, but you don't get the smells of the shampoo. And so there's something that's missing from your life, something qualitative that doesn't seem to be there. So the really cool thing I think about the consciousness of smell is it makes us rethink how we can have different kinds of consciousness and the relations between them. Whenever we're aware of smell, there's always going to be a phenomenology. But even when we're unaware and not attending, there's this qualitative character of smells pervading our lives. And this is one way it comes out when it comes to thinking about anosmia. When you have anosmia, you have difficulty in living. I mean, obviously, it's not anything that anyone wants to suffer through, but the difficulty in living kind of comes out in your daily occurrences of affairs that you would imagine would be simple things like whether or not you did your laundry. And so people who have anosmia every now and then worry that maybe they put their laundry in the load and then they let it sit for a little bit too long and then it kind of got that moldy smell. And they'll never know,
Ah,
Yeah.
right? They don't
Yeah,
know
interesting.
whether or
Oliver
not
Sacks has a couple of stories about patients with this condition who develop very serious forms of social anxiety because they don't know how they smell
Literally
to
last night,
those
I
around
was
them.
watching TV with my partner and he was like, "What smells like feet?" And it turned out that it was my vintage jeans that needed to be washed.
It turned out it was your feet, actually.
No, it wasn't. It was not even my feet. It was legit the jeans because you know how like jeans, if you don't wash them for a while, kind of start to smell like feet, and it's like, yeah. In any case, sorry,
Yeah.
TMI.
No, but I mean, I
no.
I also wonder if we all have our own particular smell that we are habituated into carrying with us as part of our lived experience. The moment that you can't smell, you can't recognize yourself any longer, or you
Yeah.
feel like there's something off
Hmm.
about yourself. Because when thinking about self-recognition, we often think about the mirror stage, right? We recognize ourselves by image, tapping into that history of privileging vision that you're talking about, Ben. But I suspect we might unconsciously, I wouldn't be able to articulate it, have an implicit, tacit understanding of our own smell. And once that's knocked out, then there is a misrecognition potentially
Hmm.
of the self that's very primal, and very basic.
Yeah, so that's actually what I'm working on right now. So I don't know is the actual answer. That's exactly kind of the way I want to go with this, right? So we do track our own body odor. It doesn't seem like we do it consciously, right? But if it turns out to be that you're worried whether or not you have the right hygiene before you leave the house, you can at least sniff yourself, right, and attend to it. Nosmics can't do that, right? So they're worried that
Yeah.
maybe they're giving off bad odor. There's a really cool thing with perfumes, where it turns out to be that for a while we thought perfumes were worn to like mask your body odor. But it turns out to be that they actually boost your immune signature of smells,
Hmm.
such that you buy a perfume that complements your immune smell, which explains why when you buy your own perfumes, you usually love them. But when someone else buys a perfume for you, even if it's the same brand that you usually like or similar smells, it doesn't usually in the end have the same uptake, right? So for a while, when I said I was working on smells, people thought it'd be really fun as like gifts to buy me perfumes, right? And every now and then you'd pick one up and you'd be like, "That's not me at all. Like, why would you do
No, no, no.
that?"
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
No, that and one of the other people that we are interviewing in connection to smell is an expert on perfumery. So this has been a
Ooh.
really rich discussion of the philosophy and science of smell.
Yeah, we're so
And
grateful,
yes,
Ben. Thank
oh,
you
well,
so much. This
thank
has just
you.
been really enlightening, and you've covered so many fascinating topics in this philosophy of smell. So
yeah,
thank
and although
you.
we don't smell you now, since this is an online interview, we do see you, we encourage our readers to look at Ben Young's work on the cognition, consciousness, and perception of smells.
Yes, including
Oh,
your exciting forthcoming book. All right, thank you so much, Ben, and thanks
well,
to our listeners and viewers. And I'll say,
well,
and thanks to our listeners.
well, thank you
For
for
those of you
having
who are
me.
just listening to the podcast version.
And I'll have to smell you both later.
Yes, smell you later.